Chapter 6 Driven Off. Some miserable poaching skunk from Aberdaron has been here, said Mr. Hughes, shaking his head sadly as the crayfish pots came up empty. And this, the best spot for crays in all the roads. It was the crack of dawn, and the Warspite, her engine and its ancient chain drive rattling busily away, was close in under the rocky sides of St. Tudwall's Island, at a special place where Mr. Hughes was accustomed to put down crayfish pots. He had been a fisherman out of Pwllheli, which he was not in the deep-water ships, and he knew every crayfish hole and every rock round all Cardigan Bay. It was the ship's custom to pick up the pots when there was a chance, and this was a good moment for it, as she was off on her way for a good sail. But there was nothing in the pots, and no bait either. The weather did not look very promising, but there rarely was any promise in a Cardigan Bay dawn, except of bad weather, even in the shelter of the little island, which lay well in round the corner of the roads. A slop on the sea made the ketch dip and roll, and there was a wet sighing in the wind that boded no good. While some boys were getting the pots up, the others went for a scramble ashore to pick up gulls' eggs on the peaty island summit. There was a flat stone to land on, and a rough path led to the top. It was a queer place, and though the holiday hamlet of Abersoch was just across the roads, the boys felt that they would not like to be marooned there. They had time only for a quick scramble, and then back aboard with a bucket half full of eggs. The Warspite lay about her own length from the rocks, but she was quite safe. The boys were aboard quick. Well, back out, the captain said, "Go astern." This he called down through the skylight to the engineer. There was an awful row going on in the little engine room, with much clanging and rattling of metal. Yank looked down in some mild alarm, but was partly reassured to see that most of the noise came from a long endless chain which was rushing round at the forward end of the engine room. The Warspite was built as an ocean-going yacht before the days of good auxiliary engines, and had never been intended to have one, so she was not properly fitted with a propeller driven from an engine. Instead, an ancient paraffin engine had been installed at some time in her long career above a propeller shaft, and the shaft, and so the propeller was turned by a system of cog wheels and a chain drive like a bicycle wheel. The chain rushed around, the cogs rushed around, and the propeller rushed around too. Sometimes the engine drove the chain, and the chain drove the propeller, and the engine was old and weak, and the propeller was small. "Full astern," shouted the captain, blowing 3 short blasts on his whistle at the same time. "Full astern, sir," shouted the engineer, almost covered with black oil. There was the most terrible noise from the engine room. The engine coughed and spluttered, and there was a commotion, as if large pieces of metal were being exploded from it. Metal clashed on metal. Sparks flew. Black smoke poured through the exhaust in the ship's side. Then the engine began to race. The ship, which never had had much appreciable sternway, came to a stop. "Hoist the staysail, Mr. Hughes." "Staysail halyards, my lads. Lively now." The big staysail forward was hauled aloft in a matter of seconds. The engine meantime was stopped, and the little engineer, his face blacker than ever, appeared at the combing of his teak skylight with a length of chain in his oily hand. "It is the chain. Drive again, sir," he announced, more in sorrow than in anger. "Well, we'd better go back to anchor now, and you slip ashore and get it fixed at the garage," replied the captain. Trouble with the chain was obviously nothing new. "Is it any worse than usual? You can fix it, I suppose." "It's an awful mess, but it can be fixed. But what we are needin', sir, is a new engine altogether." The captain stroked his cheek. The ship could manage quite well under sail alone, though the engine was undoubtedly a great help when going through bar passages, and keeping away from the causeway and out of trouble. Generally, engineers always wanted new and bigger engines. "I'm not liking the look of the weather," said the mate in the captain's other ear. What a pair of pessimists! There was plenty of evidence in support of the mate's remark, for the gray morning was anything but promising. Overhead, wherever it was clear, already the high scud was flying, though the official forecast was good enough. From St. Tudwall's Island to an anchorage in the roads was a short distance, and with the staysail run down, the Black Ketch was soon anchored again. Before the boat could be prepared to take the engineer ashore, a small motor boat from the beach was seen coming off. In a few minutes it was alongside. There was only one man in it, a local boatman, who acted as a sort of agent at Abersoch for the school and the Ketches. "They're wanting you to come ashore and phone the school captain," he shouted as soon as he was within hail. "There's a message for you." "Keep a good eye on her, Mr. Mate," were the captain's parting words. "I agree with you about the weather, but it is probably only local. It happens so often here, you know. Give her plenty of cable if the sea starts rolling in, and watch the forecast. I'll be back as quickly as I can. The cones aren't up yet." The captain and engineer jumped into the motorboat, which was away ashore, with them without loss of time. The captain's remark about the cones not being up was a reference to the official gale warning signals. If a gale was expected, signal shapes made of canvas in the form of cones were hoisted at the signal staffs of all the Coast Guard stations, and one such staff was in clear view from the ship. The boys watched the boat make for the entrance of the little river, and disappear round the bluff headland by the yacht club. An uncomfortable lop was already coming into the roads, and the wet sighing of the wind had noticeably increased. It was poor weather, undoubtedly, but not exactly bad as yet. We'll close reef the mainsail, and look to the storm lashings of everything, my boys," said the mate. "There's not like being prepared." He looked a little grim as he said that, and Yank noticed that all the time they were shaking out the canvas and putting it in the double reef. Mr. Hughes kept looking out to sea towards the southwest, as if he expected a hard blow from there at any moment. "You don't think the ship's safe in these roads, Mr. Hughes?" Yank asked. "No ship's safe in Cardigan Bay anywhere, my son, but there's shelter here, surely, from anything but south to east." "There's good shelter from winds, from southwest, right around through west to northeast." "Aye, but the wind often sets in suddenly with freshening squalls that come from south. The winds seem to funnel in the bay." I'm not liking it. Indeed, I'm not." "Is there a safe anchorage we can make for, if it did come on to blow a gale?" "There's Pwaheli. It's the only safe place around here, but we're neaped out of there, neaped out of everywhere. There's too little water in these tides, and they're all bar harbors, you know, made by rivers. Rivers build up bars at their mouths, or spill sand down somewhere to get in the way of ships," Mr. Hughes explained. "We'll shift anchorage when the captain comes back, and make her snug. She'd do all right just behind the island, but we'd need power to get her there. He'll be bringing back the chain." The mate spoke quietly enough, but he kept looking at the weather. There was no sign of the returning boat. Mr. Hughes said it might take hours to fix the links. It was early in the morning, and the forge would have to be started. Now, to windward, it was obvious that a heavy squall was making up. How heavy? Large drops of rain began to fall. Mr. Hughes paced up and down by the wheel, now looking somewhat anxiously towards the beach, whence no boat came, now to seaward, where anything might be brewing. The anchorage where the Warspite lay was not the one she had left earlier, and she was somewhat exposed to the wind blowing in. Further in line with the lifeboat house, there was a better place. Mr. Hughes made up his mind in a very few moments. He'd take the ketch in there without further ado under sail. "Heave up, my lads, heave up. All hands to man the capstan." "All hands man the capstan," was the instant response. The boys were ready. The cable was led round the capstan in the way that it should go. The forestaysail and the mizzen were loosed and ready to set. Two boys jumped below to stow the chain in the locker beneath the floor boards of their quarters as it came in. The rest took the capstan bars and began to tramp round the small capstan. Steadily the cable came in, link by link. "Heave lively, my lads, lively now." The mate struck up an old capstan song he'd learned when he was in the big Cape Horners. By this time the rain was coming down in torrents, which now and then shut off the view of all but the nearest land, and the wind was freshening steadily. Heave and break her, heave and she must, heave till you bust. Straining at the capstan bars, the boys heaved and heaved, for the holding ground was good just there, and the anchor clung to the mud. Get the staysail and the mizzen on her. Yank, you go to the wheel. As soon as you feel she has way, keep her up. We'll get to windward a bit and see what happens. It mightn't be too good to get in by that point now, and the open sea's the safest place for us. The sails thrashed and boomed as they were being hoisted. The boys were glad the big area was already shortened by the reefs they had tucked in earlier. With the reefed mizzen and the fore staysail aloft, the ketch broke the anchor out herself. Yank watched carefully at the wheel, for she was leaping like a bronco. Now, lads, get the anchor up and secured. The warspite's anchor had to be lifted up to the rail and lashed there. It was not the stockless type. This meant heavy work. Mr. Hughes led the way, with Hans the Icelander and the 2 Conway lads, and Chum Jones close at his heels, the others following. Getting the anchor secured in a sea way was not easy, but they managed. As yet the force of the sea was not running into the roads. No sooner was the job done than a temporary clearing of the rain showed more ugly squalls racing in from the North Atlantic. Perhaps they were local, but they certainly looked as if they had come a long way. We'll plug about here until the captain comes out. Then we'll get her snug into a hole behind the island. I know just the place. She's been there before, said Mr. Hughes. We'll be all right, my lads. Now for a bit of a sail. The ketch was plunging along, a cloud of spray at her bows, but it was soon obvious that the tide was carrying her inshore, too close inshore. There was not much water for her there. The sea was breaking at the foot of the cliffs by Lonbedrog. We'll have to set the main. Mr. Hughes, standing by the wheel, speaking almost to himself. No trace of anxiety was evident in his voice. All hands to set the mainsail, he shouted. Again the boys ran to the halyards, Mr. Hughes at the head of the line. It was when the gaff was halfway aloft that the accident happened, as quick as a flash. Mr. Hughes was working like a dozen men, setting a magnificent example and exhorting the boys to the utmost effort, his great arms flailing at the halyards, and his mighty voice booming out the musical sailing ship calls to set the rhythm of the work. With the gaff half aloft, something jammed. He ran out quickly from the foot of the mast to see, and just at that moment the jammed gear freed, the halyards parted, and down came the peak, hitting him fairly across the head. If the gaff had not been hollow, Mr. Hughes would have been killed. As it was, there was the mate, stretched unconscious on the deck, a trickle of blood slowly oozing from beneath his cap. The ship was leaping and rolling. The gaff was banging, and the sail was making a noise like breakers thundering on the beach. And nearby and to leeward, that very sound itself added to the tumult. The breakers now were thundering upon the beach, with a vengeance, and the big ketch was driving upon them without way enough to claw off. Yank, at the wheel, caught a glimpse, through the murk, of a boat trying to make for them from the river, but it could not catch up. At the precise moment the gaff halyards carried away, the wind came down like a blow from an avalanche, and roared across the water in a smoke of spray and spume. The warspite staggered. The very force of the wind, for the moment, kept the sea down, and the ketch raced. The staysail and the reefed mizzen were canvas enough just now. The boy at the wheel kept the ship to her course, steering her with the utmost care, though she was over almost on her side, and the conditions were alarming. Where could the ship go? Still, she was being set alee, despite her apparent speed through the water. Yank tried to remember from the chart the lay of the bay up there, Tremadoc Bay. To windward somewhere, and not far, he remembered, indeed perilously close, were the treacherous rocks of the Giant's Causeway, or St. Patrick's Causeway, whatever it was called. God help the ship if she got on them. To leeward. Aye, now what was there? No harbor, nowhere to run. He remembered all too clearly Mr. Hughes sang that neat out of everywhere, no place to go. No water on the bar at Pwaheli, which was so close by and safe, if only the ship could be sailed in there. No water on the bar of the river of Portmadoc, and heaven help the ship if she were set down upon those grim rocks off there. The whole of Tremadoc Bay was a terrible lee shore, and the rocks of the causeway made the arm of a great trap which penned them in. Tiny, Hans, get the mainsail down. Get some gaskets round the sail before it blows out. He called to his watchmates. The Icelander and a group of the boys had got Mr. Hughes temporarily into the lee scuppers, where he lay unconscious and, for all they knew, dying. They whipped some lashing round his inanimate body to hold him for the moment, and jumped to get the gaff secured, and then the sail, which was blowing about like the side of a circus tent in a hurricane. Tiny Donaldson showed himself well worthy of his selection as watch captain. Getting down the gaff was no easy task. Again and again the canvas of the mainsail broke out of their grip as they tried to fight it down. The rain continued pouring, and every boy was thoroughly wet through. The roaring of the wind in the rigging was a noisy challenge, and they worked like demons. Even so, it must have taken the best part of an hour to get the gaff properly down and the sail bundled up in its gaskets, with a good stow and a tight skin, so it would not blow away again. 3 times it had blown out. Thank heaven for the reefs in it. The full mainsail would have been unmanageable. As soon as the sail was reasonably secured, Tiny fought his way along the reeling deck to the wheel to confer with Yank. This looks like being one of those unforgettable experiences they were telling us about, shouted Yank above the noise of the wind. Tiny grinned. But where do we go from here? She's being set towards the beach all the time, and already we've lost a lot. That's the question. We'll keep her up with the sail she's got on at the moment. First thing we've got to do is to get Mr. Hughes down below where he can be comfortable, but I don't know how bad he may be hurt. He was only hit on the head, I mean, nothing internal or anything like that. Tiny seemed to think that a blow across the head, even with a flailing gaff, was the sort of thing any old sea dog should be able to take in his stride. Tiny, you take the wheel a moment, and I'll have a look at him. Not that I know the answers. Yank chose a moment when the ship was lurching in the right direction to fight his way across to the lee bulwarks, where poor Mr. Hughes lay bundled up in a piece of line, in an oil-skinned heap. The trickle of blood from his head wound had stopped. At least he had some color, and appeared to be breathing. It was going to be immensely difficult getting him down below. Meanwhile the wind was increasing and increasing until it was blowing half a gale, and its direction varied from south-southwest to south-southeast. Yank fought his way back to the wheel, where all the boys had gathered. Taking Taffy, he went into the companionway to have a look at the chart. The night compass in there was lying over at a crazy angle. I don't like the look of this chart. Look at it. The whole place is littered with hell's mouths and devil's tails and other nice names, and it's all the lousiest, rock-filledest, dangerousest hole I ever did see. How are we going to get out of this, with the wind forcing us into its worst corners? Beat out, Taffy said. That's what we have to do. We'll have to beat out of Tremadoc Bay anyway, and then hope for the weather to improve. Ships have done it before, you know. They had to, whenever they came out of Portmadoc. Beat out, but the violent wind and the set of the tide were forcing them nearer and nearer to the farthest leeward corner of the bay. Taffy peered through the glass sides of the little deck house. I've seen us drive by Pwllheli, he said, and Penny Chain, and Ch6-9 now cannot be far away. Maybe we could get a lee under Ch6-9 Castle. Maybe, but I doubt it. We'll have a go at it if she continues down to leeward like this, or get the mainsail on her. Think she'll stand it, Yank? Looks like she'll have to. The close-reefed main, anyway. Let's get those halyards spliced and rove again. Hey, Tiny, Hans, Chum Jones gives a hand to fix the main halyards. Yank dashed out on deck with Taffy at his heels. Tiny was struggling manfully with the wheel, trying to keep the ship up to the wind, with the cold sprays and the wild spume breaking all over her. Yank shouted to him what he proposed to do, and the lads fought their way to the front of the main mast. Mr. Hughes forgotten for the moment. The great job was to fix the halyards so the sail could be set again. Unfortunately, the boys found that the halyards had parted where the hemp line was married to the light pliable wire of which most of the halyards were formed. It was a difficult job of real sailoring to marry the two parts together, the more so as the warspite was trying to play leapfrog with the wild sea. Time and time again she flung the boys down in a heap on the deck. They fought their way to their feet again, only to be flung down once more. The galley funnel went overboard like a feather in a gale, and the sails were wind-stiffened like sheets of armor plate. Sea spray and rain wet them through and through, but the lads stuck to the job. Yank and Hans, the Icelander, knew a little about splicing, and so did the Conways and Chum Jones, but none of them had any experience of this kind of thing. Just as the last tuck was being made, Taffy looked up and pointed through the murk of flying spray. "Ch6 Castle," he shouted, as the grey ruins on their solid cliff showed in a temporary clearing, with a line of grey houses inland, back of the cliff, and a wall of white water breaking at its foot. A glance showed Yank that there was no hope of shelter in the lee of that cliff. There was no lee. The great breakers were flinging themselves everywhere along the rocky beach. "We'll have to get the peak of the main up and beat her out now fast," Taffy shouted. "There's only a mile or two to go before she's on the Portmadoc bar." But it was almost impossible to get anything set. The violent wind, ever freshening, was determined to roar at all their efforts like an angry demon, waiting to dash the ship on the rocks in the corner of the bay, and grind her to matchwood. If that happened, no one was going to swim away. Yank knew that full well. The trouble was that in those conditions of wind and tide and violent sea, the ketch could not fight to windward out of the trap with only the reefed mizzen and the storm staysail set. "That sail must go aloft," said Yank grimly through clenched teeth. "Come on, boys. Aloft with her, peak first. Away now together, long and strong." They missed the mate's strength, even though they took the throat halyards to the capstan with 4 boys heaving on the bars there, and the rest of them tallied on the peak halyards. Slowly, slowly, the bulk of the big main fought its way aloft. Time and time again, it seemed that their efforts would be useless, or the sail would blow itself out. But it had been sewn well. Thank the Lord for that. It did not blow out. Cloth by cloth, inch by inch, they fought it up, until it was set, at least, well enough to give some useful driving power to the ship. It was only then they looked and saw the roaring tumult of the sea upon Portmadoc bar. Close alee, within a matter of moments, the ship would be matchwood, unless she could hold her own. Hold her own, she had to fight to windward too, and then the line of cruel rocks of the dreaded causeway was right in her path. "Life jackets, my lads," said Yank, in as quiet a voice as he could use in that howling wind. They'd forgotten them earlier. As far as he could see, the ship had now no chance at all. She had been set down too far to beat out again now. "Cross the causeway, cross the causeway," the shout was in the Cape horn voice of Mr. Hughes. "Cross the causeway, there is a way." Chapter 7. Across the Causeway. There is a way. The words galvanized the boys into action. The ship, too, seemed to be gathering way. Maybe the tide was changing. Maybe she could claw off. The boys ran to the place where Mr. Hughes was lying in the scuppers. They found him very white, peering over the rail in the direction of the grim mountains behind Port Madoc. Tiny Donaldson and Michael Leary held him up. Hans the Icelander was at the wheel, where he obviously was an expert. "The only way out of this lee corner," Mr. Hughes spoke with the utmost difficulty and seemed to be fighting to remain conscious, "is to cross the causeway. I don't know if she can make it at all with this sea. Get me to the wheel where I can see." The boys threw the mate's lashings off and dragged him carefully across the deck. It was not far, but with the ship's bucking and lurching and jumping, and the constant sprays and heavy water breaking over her, it was a very difficult job. Everything was immensely difficult. Getting the lashings off, steadying Mr. Hughes to see he did not fall, getting him across the pitching, reeling, soaking decks. Once or twice, while they tried, he lapsed into unconsciousness again, but at last they managed. Meanwhile the ship was snoring along on the starboard tack, heading somewhere south, right towards the causeway. As soon as he heard there was a passage there, Yank had shouted to the Icelander to give the ship a little way and let her go off the wind slightly. But the infernal wind was hauling west and southwest in ever-freshening squalls, as if it was determined to force the ship on to the lee shore before she ever had a chance of trying her luck with the causeway. Mr. Hughes looked up again and peered into the murk astern. "Even with this tide and the water banked up with the wind, it's a chance," he muttered. They bent close to hear what he said. "She might make it, but I've got to be able to see. There's marks. I'm looking for Molligist." "Who the heck's Molly Guest?" asked Yank in bewilderment. "A hill," Taffy explained. "It's a hill ashore he's looking for. Mole Hill. It's a Welsh word." "I want to see Molligest," said Mr. Hughes, "and Molhabog back of that. Taffy now, boy, do you see them?" "I don't know Molligest, Mr. Hughes. It's from Nevin I am. I've never been this way before." "Molligest and Molhabog in line. That'll bring us to the channel east of the causeway. Bring me the glasses, lad, and hold them for me." 6 boys rushed for the deck companion, where the ship's binoculars were kept, glad to know they were an exceptionally good pair, from a captured German submarine. Mr. Hughes peered at the murky outline of the nearby coast, long and hard. Sometimes he gesticulated feebly with one hand, signaling to the Icelander at the wheel to fall away from the wind a little, or to come up. Astern the murk was thick, but now and again the boys could see the loom of the hills, and sometimes the dim outline of a big hill by Portmadoc, and the mountains beyond in the Snowdon foothills. "I've got Mulhabog, Mr. Hughes," Taffy shouted excitedly. "I've got Mulhabog." He pointed somewhere astern in the grey rain. "Aye, lad, and yonder's Molagest, steady as she goes. There, steady as she goes." "Can I ease the main sheet a trifle, sir, to give her better way now? Seems like the wind isn't drawing any more ahead," Yank asked anxiously. He had the situation well sized up, too. Well, maybe. From the furthest leeward corner of grim Tremadoc Bay, the coast of North Wales trended south by Harlech and by Morfa-Durfin towards Barmouth Way. Once the ship was over the causeway, if she did get over the causeway, she would at least have room to maneuver. For a while, the wind was forcing her towards the rocks all the time, but she had a deep keel and a fine hull, and she should hold her own now. The sails were properly set, so long as they stood. He looked up at main and mizzen, but so far, at any rate, they were all right. There was not a sign of a split or a parted stitch anywhere, though the strain on them was terrific. The ship was burying her black bows into some of the turbulent steep seas, and throwing heavy water halfway up the mast as she fought her way along, easing the main sheet. Even a trifle would help. She would sail faster then. Soon it might not be necessary to keep her right up into the wind's eye, as high as she could go. "Hold everything yet a while. Don't start anything," said Mr. Hughes. "When we get among the breakers, then maybe." Among the breakers? Why, of course, there would be an absolute turmoil of boiling, maddened sea all about the Causeway Rocks, miles and miles and miles of it. Only a perfect ship could live through such a sea. It cleared a little astern. Thank heaven for that, at any rate. Taffy and Mr. Hughes got good bearings from the hills. They were keeping in line. Molagest and Mulhabog, a much higher mountain, further inland, kept in line astern of the ship, would lead her to the place where there might be water enough to let the ship fight across the causeway. It was not a real channel. It was the place where the rocks dropped lowest below the sea. There might be 18 or 20 feet of water in some places, but it all depended upon the force and the height of the breakers, and the ship could be overwhelmed in the horrible breakers too, even without being dropped upon the rocks and pounded to pieces. "Secure everything, Yank. Make sure no water can get in, or the seas will swamp her." Mr. Hughes was weakening again. His head fell forward. His eyes glazed. Yank had seen to the companionways and the skylights before, and everything was as secure against water as it could be made. The doors of the small deck-house were closed, and the canvas covers were over everything. Some water found its way below, of course, but no dangerous weight of sea was yet down there, or even on deck, for the big ketch rode like a race horse, a thoroughbred steeplechaser, taking a series of difficult fences. She rose to every sea, as if determined to escape its wrath, and leapt towards the next, and the next, and the next, but they must be approaching the causeway now. The seas rose higher, higher, higher. The wind roared. The water flew horizontally away from the wet shrouds, and the halyards, and every piece of cordage. The bows dipped deeper and deeper, as if they were trying to bite the water angrily. The wake astern streamed back in a wide foam-flecked river. The seas smashed at the bows like great wet sledge-hammers. The very mainmast seemed to sway as the ship would lurch violently to leeward and then bring up, all trembling, as if bracing herself to meet the shock of the next wall of dreadful water. The strain upon the weather rigging made the stays hum and sing like a great harp upon which the fiends of hell were playing. To windward now they saw the causeway. It boiled and smoked and fumed, and the visibility that way was not more than 100 yards. 100 yards of such a scene were enough, more than enough. Could any ship live in that? Hans at the wheel kept the ship to the last compass course. Mr. Hughes had steadied him on, with the mountains in line astern, but the compass swung and lurched and jumped just as the ship did, and sometimes it would swing violently through an arc of half a dozen points. None among the boys, but an experienced Icelander, indeed, could have held to a compass course just then. To him, keeping a wayward little ship to something like her course was familiar enough, and even a Cardigan Bay gale off Iceland would be a summer breeze. Impassive, stalwart, his blue eyes peering kindly from beneath the brim of an outsize sou'wester, water streaming down his face, and down his neck, and everywhere. Hans was in control of the wheel, and indeed of the ship. Now he had to cling to the spokes, lest he be flung right overboard as the ketch stumbled in her headlong stride. Now he braced himself, sea-booted young legs akimbo, as she fell in a hole in the sea. The spray tore at him, and the spume lashed him, and the wind shrieked in his ears, and flung its needle points of spray into his eyes. Beside him, huddled on the teak grating there, was the figure of the half-conscious Mr. Hughes. On the other side, Yank, clinging with both hands to the mizzen rigging. Behind him the boys, clinging to whatever they could to keep themselves from being blown or flung or washed over the side. Lifelines had been rigged fore and aft, for this was regular practice, even in the best of weather, and it was as well they had. It was encouraging in all that tumult to catch a glimpse of the calm face of Hans the Icelander. No tenseness there. Maybe he had not seen the chart, but he could see the breakers, for they were all around. Now the ship rode in the very breakers, and all the land astern was shut from view. She must keep the compass course, or die. Each time as she flung herself, half buried in the spray, into some frightful hole left by a passing sea, Yank expected to hear the dreadful crunch that would tell of pounding. She would pound only once, for those rocks would reach up and smash her as she tried to pass, ripping off her great lead keel, capsizing her in the murderous surf. To leeward the surf boiled and boiled towards the rock-bound land. No help there, for all that land was nothing but a death trap for ships, forced upon it, in weather such as that. The Icelander smiled to see the way the good ship was fighting for her life. These English could build a ship. Even if she did go down, she was going fighting, and never for a moment did it occur to him that she would lose. To Mr. Hughes, to Taffy from Nevin, it was perhaps a different story. They remembered well long histories of doomed ships, and drowned men. Not many ships had ever beaten the sea here, but a few had. Generally, they had beaten the sea by running for Portmadoc Bar, which could be as dangerous as beating across the causeway. The bones of many a good ship were strewn on both. The moments now seemed hours. Still there came no crunching of keel upon the rock, no fatal final pound. The sea was almost burying the ship every time she flung herself forward, and the ketch was halted in her stride, so that her progress became a nightmare, leap-frogging with a watery grave at the bottom of each leap. Yet onwards she came, always fighting. Now the boys were one tense group, not saying anything, not hoping anything, clinging there, waiting. Would she make it? Could she make it? Could any vessel live in so wild an onslaught of the sea? There were times when the answer seemed to be a fatal no. Yet still she did not pound, though the snarl of the rocks must be right below them. Once, in a break to windward for a second, Yank thought he saw the granite of the causeway bared as the sea, having flung itself to a violent height, retreated for a moment to gather strength for the next mad fury. He glanced anxiously aloft at the wheel, at the half-conscious Mr. Hughes. The ship still kept her steerage way. Not even the most violent sea that swept over her quite halted her. Nobody sounded with the lead line. There was no use sounding. Either she got across, now she was in the channel, or she did not. How much water was under her keel, if any, was in the hands of God. The answer really lay in how far she fell in the trough. The really important sounding would be made by her keel. She stumbled on. Like a stricken animal, like a great sailfish fighting the hook, like a wounded gazelle seeking sanctuary before its bloodstream poured out, Mr. Hughes dragged himself to his feet, staggered to the compass, knelt beside the little bowl, clinging to the binnacle. His cap had rolled off and blown overboard. His old gray-red hair had mottled with blood and wet with rain. He peered across the compass card, staring into the murk abeam to pick out some well-known point. Would it never show? "What is it now?" asked Taffy. Mulfur, son, know it now?" "No, Mr. Hughes, I've heard of it, though. It's a high mountain between Harlech and Barmouth. We must bring it abeam." "Ah, there are many mountains here. But show it to me, Mr. Hughes, when you see it. Then I'll keep an eye on it. There, I see it, nearly abeam already. She's sailing, boy. She's a beauty. She's going to get out of here." Mr. Hughes turned to Hans at the wheel. "As she goes," he shouted, his voice much stronger. "You're doing fine." Again he bent to the little compass card. the wild swinging and lunging of which seemed to disconcert him as little as it did the Icelander. They were a pair in this sort of thing. It was blowing as hard as ever, but the rain had eased. Astern, the outlines of the hills about Portmadoc were quite clear now, and Harlech Castle showed its stubborn, square block huge upon its hill. Moligest showed up well enough for all to see. Mockris Point, down on the sea, was lost sometimes in a rage of breaking water, but it was there. Mr. Hughes, gesticulating heavily, pointed it out to Hans. Now keep her as she goes on this good course, until yon Mockris Point comes into line with Moligest. He shouted as well as he could, and Taffy repeated, "Then keep them astern a while, and she'll be clear. There's other banks about, but none to worry her once she rides the causeway here." The speech was too long for the injured mate. Still clinging to the binnacle, his head fell forward, and he lapsed again into unconsciousness. But his work was done. The ketch still stumbled, lurched, contorted madly in an insane field of leaping sea, but the weight of water was gone from her slim decks now. No longer did her bow bury itself so deep as she met the onrush of the seas. The longer, truer sea already was evidence that the worst was past. What might still be in store for her the boys did not know, but she was across, over the causeway. Yank sweated at the mere sight of the raging sea astern. Now that its most dangerous fury was behind them, the Icelander grinned. Chapter 8. Where do we go now? The ship might be safely across the worst of the causeway, but now where could she go? The boys were so relieved to be out of the worst savagery of the sea that for the moment they forgot that while the gale was blowing there was nowhere for the warspite to go in search of shelter, at any rate not in Cardigan Bay. They turned to Mr. Hughes, but poor Mr. Hughes had maintained consciousness only by a supreme effort for the passage of the causeway. Now he had passed right out. "Let's get the mate below where he can be out of the cold and the water first," said Yank. "Then we'll worry about what to do next. Keep her as she goes, Iceland." "Oh ho," said the Icelander at the wheel, looking as if there was nowhere on earth he would sooner be. "As she goes." The boys struggled to get Mr. Hughes down the companion-way and into the saloon. The ship still jumped and lurched and leaped all over the place, though nothing like she had when among the causeway breakers. Her bows now rose right out of the water and tried to jump into the sky, only to drop again an instant afterwards and try to bury themselves in the depths of the sea. But no longer were they really being buried, nor did heavy water break over the bulwarks and descend on deck. Sprays and spume flew everywhere. To stand at the wheel was like being in the backwash at the foot of Niagara Falls. But it was not now really dangerous. It took the best part of an hour to get the unconscious mate below, his outer garments removed, and to put him in his bunk. An eerie light came through the big skylights, with their canvas covers shipped. everything was difficult, almost as if there were some power trying to make things as difficult as possible. Boys stumbled and fell, flung off their balance by the violent motion of the ship. One or two had to run for the companion and dash back on deck, where they were immediately and violently seasick, for the motion in the confined space down below, without the fresh sea air, was more than they could stand. But they always came back again. Poor Mr. Hughes' bunk was rather wet too, and the little cabin was damp and cheerless. The boys chalked him in his bunk with cushions from the settee, and hoped for the best. For the moment there was nothing further they could do, and they hoped that the mate would come round again soon, in a matter of hours maybe, at the worst, in a day or two. One was left with him to keep watch. Yank, Tiny, Taffy, Titch Edwards, Chum Jones, and Mike O'Leary gathered in the glass-sided deck house to peer anxiously at the chart and consult about the best thing to do. It was as much as they could manage to keep their balance in the deck house, even sitting down, or trying to sit. Yank had the chart, and Taffy was explaining it. First, said Tiny Donaldson, "I vote we need a captain in this ship. My vote's for Yank." "But what about you? You're watch captain, aren't you?" came a chorus. "Yank is the only one among us, except perhaps old Iceland, at the wheel there, and we wouldn't know what he wanted us to do, who's been really at sea before in a vessel like this. So Yank should have charge until Mr. Hughes recovers. I'll be glad to be mate. What about it, Yank?" "Why, fellows, I thank you, and I'll be glad to do what I can, but I don't know these waters, you know." "None of us do. You can sail the ship. I've never been out in a thing this size before." "All right, that's settled. Now, where do we go from here? Where on earth can we go?" Indeed, this was a problem. The visibility had worsened again. To leeward, sometimes the bleak and awful coast of Wales showed in the stormy murk, but sometimes it was hidden from view altogether, and round them everywhere was nothing but the boiling sea, like a scum upon the surface of a dismal devil's brew, all streaky green and grey and dirty white, and altogether depressing. The chart showed that though the wind was favourable enough to run for Barmouth, they could not get in at that port because there was not water enough on the bar to let the ship run in. The same thing applied to Aberdovey. What a murder of mad water would be raging on the bar there! Besides, there were more dangers in Cardigan Bay. The causeway was not the only miserable arm of rocks reaching out to increase the perils of a dangerous lee shore. Off Towin were the Bwitch Shoals, and though there might be water enough on them to get across, it would be foolish to get among them if it could be avoided. A ship which had crossed the causeway in a gale of wind might not have much to fear from the Bwitch Shoals, but the sea there would be violent and confused, and it was no use looking for trouble. I'd like to have a look at Aberdovey, so they'd see us ashore, maybe, and at least know we hadn't gone down," said Yank. "But then what? There's another lot of no-good shoals and rocks and patches off Aberystwyth, south of that, and a bad lot too. No, we can't get among them. We'll have to keep her on this tack until we get to windward of the whole causeway, and then wear around and go for St. Tudwall's again," said Chum Jones, to everyone's astonishment. "Why, that's sense," said Yank, looking at Chum Jones approvingly. "The old Welsh brains coming out at last. Now that Wales is trying to drown him." They laughed at this, Chum joining. Indeed, his was the only practicable course. Yank had hoped to keep the ship sailing towards the south until she was able to get behind the shelter of the long nose of Wales, which stretched towards Ireland, perhaps behind the headland at New Quay, or down to Fishguard. But he observed ruefully that the awkward arm of rocks called the Patches, reaching out into Cardigan Bay off Aberystwyth, made such a course impractical. The wind showed no sign of easing. The big ketch could not beat on for ever under so great a spread of canvas. Yet she must carry sail to make over the ground. He looked aloft as he thought of this, for the 100th time that day. The big sails were standing up. Well, so far, but for how long? The strain was terrific. Going about was not going to be funny. Well, they could not stand on, and they would have to go about, and go about too, without knowing clearly where they were, gale-driven there, in the dreadful trap of Cardigan Bay. They were out of the worst of it, yes, but there was plenty more to come. Yank fought his way out on deck. Somewhere in the murk astern, the long, jagged arms of the infernal causeway reached miles across the Warspite's path. Somewhere in the murk ahead were two more causeways, minor ones, but dangers nonetheless. And how on earth was he going to find St. Tudwall's roads again, if the ship weathered the western end of the long causeway? How did you know where you were in a place like Cardigan Bay, when there wasn't a thing to tell you? He judged the ship's speed over the bottom. No, through the water. He couldn't know what the sets and the tides were doing under such conditions. To be perhaps 6 knots, she was heading about south, more or less parallel with the coast. So long as she kept on that track, he ought to see something before getting among the foul patches of Aberystwyth. They were a good 20 miles from the causeway. As he read the chart, he would have to chance the Bwich shallows. He made up his mind he'd stand on that tack towards the south until either he saw something identifiable or got among the broken water indicating shoals. Then he'd wear around and stand on a broad leg towards the direction in which he hoped St. Tudwall's was. They'd just have to see something identifiable up that way, too. Maybe the light in the big lighthouse would be showing by then. Maybe it would be dark, though it would take a mighty powerful light to pierce the dreadful gloom of a southwest gale. He looked aloft at the gear. that seemed to be standing all right, though the whole mizzen mast was working with every violent jump the ship made. Some of the boys were huddled round the counter, finding what shelter they could in the lee of the little engine-room skylight. Others were in the shelter of the deck-house. He sent Taffy to the lookout and relieved the Icelander at the wheel. "Coffee," said Hans inquiringly. "A good idea. See what you can do." They had had nothing to eat since breakfast. Come to think of it, Yank didn't even know what time it was. Already it seemed days since they had hauled up the crayfish pots off the island. He looked at his watch. 20 past 10, it said. Hans disappeared below to see what he could do in the galley. Taffy called a couple of the lads to help him on the lookout, on the wise principle that 6 eyes were better than 2 on such a day. The ship bounded on. Still nothing could be seen, and the rain threw itself at them as if some Western Ocean giant was playing with the ship with some outsize hose. They should be off Barmouth by this time. Still nothing. There was a bump in the land where it came out towards the westward, to the south of Barmouth Bay. They'd have to clear that. Perhaps she was doing well enough to keep far out from that land. She'd better be. All the land around that bay, thought Yank bitterly, was nothing but a trap for ships. Well, he'd do his best to see it wasn't going to trap this one, but he'd be mighty glad to get that anchor down once more in St. Tudwall's roads. Hours passed, hour after hour. He was so wet through he wondered whether his skin was still waterproof, and had visions of the driving rain soaking right into his spleen and all his veins. More hours passed, scores of them. He looked at his watch. 10 minutes to 11. No, it hadn't stopped. Up came Hans with a steaming mug of coffee and a great grin. Like he said, Hans wasted no words in gales. Like said Yank, and poured the stuff down. It was strong. At that moment there was a shout from Taffy in the bows. He was pointing at something which the lads made out to be a great clod of craggy land, black and glowering. "Whales," said Hans. "Yep, after all, it wasn't likely to be any other place." "Oh ho," said Hans. "At any rate, it was where it ought to be, well clear on the ship's lee bow." Yank judged it to be the bulge of Long Ellen by Barmouth. Taffy couldn't help in its identification. He didn't know these waters, but he allowed that Yank was probably right. He ran down to see if Mr. Hughes was conscious, to give his advice on the matter, but the mate was still dead to the world. Yank stood on. When the ketch got past this bulge and along past Towan, she would be in a good position to go round and stand northwards again, on the other tack. He daren't let her go free at all, to help her speed. Some time later, a buoy suddenly loomed up in a slight clearing in the rain, perhaps half a mile away. It could not be the Bwitch, for they were too far inshore for that. Must be so. so it could only be the buoy which marked the entrance to the fairway off Aberdovey Bar. Then the breakers would soon be alee. Were there now? The ship was making better speed than he had thought. She was fairly racing along. Aye, it was Aberdovey Outer, all right. How maddening that they could not go in. He'd have a go at it, if only there was a bit of water on the bar. But now it would be murder. To race through those thundering breakers, unable to see one channel-marking buoy from the next, and probably not able to see any at all, would be a nightmare at the best of times. Now it would be certain death. If the sands of that dreadful bar once came up to smash at the Ketch's keel, she was finished. She would be smashed to pieces in a matter of moments, and no one would live. Ready about, Yank shouted, "We'll wear her around." They could hear the breaking of the seas thundering on the bar. Just at that moment the weather suddenly cleared, and all the bar showed up before them in its awful roaring majesty. Sail into that? No, no, it would be madness. It was frightening even to know that such a place existed. For a moment or two the visibility was excellent. They could see the little Coast Guard hut by the cemetery, and make out the refuge tower on the sands, and beyond that the flagstaff at the wharf. The Coast Guard would be able to see them too, and know at least that the ship was all right so far. What they could not know was the condition of Mr. Hughes, and that the boys were in complete charge of the ship. Now the value of the drill they had gone through on the way to Abersoch, was it only the previous day, became apparent as the boys fought to their places for wearing round. They knew what to do. The ship must run off before the wind, and then come up again with the wind on the other side, and the sails would have to go over at the proper time. That was the question. Could the gear stand the awful gripping stresses, which were inevitably involved? Yank knew it was a chance, but it was a chance that must be taken, and at once. But if she'd sailed across the causeway, he told himself, she could do anything. After that, all risks were minor. He gave the teak and brass-bound wheel an affectionate pat. Tiny signaled that all was ready. Yank put the wheel up to let the ship run off. Tiny paid out a little main sheet. The boom tackle was ready to take the strain as the boom swung, when the time came so that it could not take charge and run amok. How the ship seemed to race towards the breakers, as if her sole aim was to get among them and commit an instant suicide. There was a moment when she must run deliberately towards this gravest danger before she could be brought up on the other tack. Yank kept his head. Hans the Icelander, Chum Jones, Titch Edwards, Tiny Donaldson, Mike, Taffy, all of them well knew the danger. He looked at their set, tense faces. Already they looked like men, not boys. The ship was coming round nicely. Even then he admired the beauty with which she steered and handled. "Now," he shouted. "Now," shouted the boys. Tiny set up the other main, backstay, and his shipmate Edwards immediately slacked away a lee. Hans had charge of the main sheet. Chum Jones looked to the boom tackle. Brum Shrivenham and little Sinison were looking after the mizzen, which didn't matter so much. Pete Cordoba, Don Wiggins, Curly Matheson, who had been most dreadfully seasick, and Michael Leary hauled manfully on whatever the other boys told them to haul. The staysail looked after itself. The ship rolled furiously, stumbled in her stride, came up to the wind again, as if she had been struck a violent blow. For a moment she faltered. Poor ship! She had been asked to take a lot that morning, and then slowly at first, and then bravely and without hesitation, she gathered way and thrashed along to windward. The Aberdovey outer buoy and all the land had disappeared, and the thunder of the breakers was lost in the roaring of the wind. So far so good, but dear Lord, please bring us to St. Tudwall's Roads. Yank prayed as he bent once more over the bucking wheel. Chapter 9. Through Bardsey Sound. From Aberdovey Bar to St. Tudwall's Roads is about 40 miles, making some 6 knots. It would take the ship 6 or 7 hours to reach the anchorage, but the wind was hauling free a little, and her speed was bound to increase. Maybe she would make it in 4.5 hours. She was all right now, as far as the Bwitch Shoals and the causeway were concerned, for she could weather them both. The time then was about noon, and the weather, though still bad, seemed inclined to relent. They were abeam of the Bwitch buoy, less than 40 minutes after wearing round. They passed near enough to read the name, and the big ketch was racing past the buoy. Now that he was sure of his position, Yank allowed the ship to go on to the compass course, and fall a little from the wind. It was easier for her and easier on her mast and sails and gear. How she raced along! The sprays still clouded her, but they did not now drive over her so viciously, nor clump themselves with such violence to the tops of her mast. She ran like a big thoroughbred, and took every sea like a good old steeplechaser, which, though tired and sorely tried, could still be relied upon to jump true and strong at every obstacle. With the breather, Yank organized the boys again. Curly Matheson tried to organize some food in the galley, but could not stand the motion there, and the lack of air. Hans and Chum Jones hacked some fishermen's slices from 5 loaves of bread, and passed them out with hunks of cheese. Many of the boys did not care to eat. They could keep going, and they could work, but they had no interest in food. From time to time, they went down to have a close look at Mr. Hughes, but he showed no change. Yank was anxious to get the ship back to St. Tudwall's Roads, in order to get a doctor for the old mate. He saw the place again, in his mind's eye. It was a good place to make, so long as you could see it before you went in, but there were some fearful places nearby, in which a ship could become embayed and hopelessly lost. If she mistook the headland, that was easy enough to do on such a day as this, for one Welsh headland, looming suddenly up in the rain, looked alarmingly like another. If he ran off too far and held a course too far easterly, there was a nasty chance of getting among the rocks off St. Tudwall's Island, where the bell buoy clanged its warning, or what was almost as bad, to fetch up once again to leeward of the roads, to be driven into that horrible lee corner from which they had so recently escaped. Yank kept the ship up, thinking of that. Anything was better than that. Unconsciously almost, he kept the ship to windward, always a little to the westward of her course. Better to be to windward than to leeward. He must trust to luck to see something. Each boy in turn came to the wheel, for it was not quite so necessary to keep only the best there now. To steer under such conditions was a memorable experience. Some of the lads had the ship swinging violently at times, but sooner or later they got the hang of it. 10 minutes at the wheel of the racing ship, under those conditions, was better than a month of other helmsmanship. They had to learn, and learn fast. It was incredible that they had been in the ship little more than 24 hours. Already most of them felt like Cape Horn veterans. They raced towards the causeway buoy, watching for it anxiously and listening too, as the patent log streaming astern showed the ship had run about the distance. Ah, there it was, at least a mile from where they thought it ought to be, away out on the port beam, but the chart showed there was plenty of water inside there for the war spite. The buoy was placed well out from the western edge of the line of rocks. But Yank was shaken. "This darned bay," he muttered to Taffy. "A fellow'd have to be born here to know his way around. Now I thought I was allowing plenty to get to wind'ard of that buoy. Plenty of people born around here get drowned here too," said Taffy. "Huh, you're cheerful. Well, I guess it'd be difficult to be born around here and be cheerful too. Look out fine now for St. Tudwall's Taff." Taffy went into the bows. After a while, Hans climbed into the main rigging, the better to keep lookout from there. The weather was thickening again, and there was little sign of early improvement. It was Hans who first made out the loom of the land, a great cliff towering right ahead, almost upon them. Taffy saw it the next second, and came racing aft. "Look out," he shouted, "look out! Look out for hell's mouth! Bring her up, Yank! We've missed the roads!" "Flatten in the sheets, lads!" shouted Yank, as he ran to the wheel to bring the ship up to the wind. They could see the broken, creaming water roaring at the base of the great gray cliff, and hear it washing there. The ship, responding to her wheel with grace and speed as she always did, came up to the wind again. They flattened in the sheets until she was lying close hauled again on the port tack, heading somewhere west. "Hell's mouth," shouted Taffy. "If we get in there, we won't come out again. Head westwards for Bardsey Sound. It's our only chance." "Huh," said Yank. "I don't know about Hell's Mouth, but my heart's in mine. I'm fed up with this Cardigan Bay. Bardsey Sound'll bring us out of it. It's the strait between the Isle of Saints and the western end of Wales. I know the way. I'll get her through there for you. And where in all heck do we go then?" "Ah, we can run for Nevin, then, and get her anchor down at Port Dinellan." He called it something that sounded like Port Thintlan. Where? Port Dinellan. It's my home, you know. It's a grand little place once you get in. Yank glanced at him a moment dubiously. He couldn't recall from his hurried examinations of the chart any point which qualified as a grand little place anywhere along that whole wild coast. But the problem at the moment was to keep out of this place called Hell's Mouth. "I'm all right, steering west, meantime?" he asked. "Aye, it will do. But keep her to windward as well as you can. We'll have the tide with us through Bardsey, and we'll run like a racehorse there." "How wide's this sound of yours, Taffy?" "Ah, wide enough. About half a mile at the narrowest, and full of rocks, I guess." "No, no, Bardsey Sound's clear enough itself, and the tide just rips through. If it's against a ship, she cannot go, for it brings up such a sea, she'd never live in it." Yank wondered about Bardsey Sound. It sounded a bit like the Pentland Firth to him, and at the moment they couldn't see either the high mainland of Wales nor Bardsey Island, the Isle of the Saints, as Taffy had called it, for 20,000 saints of Wales were buried there. He had to take the thing on trust. At any rate, every yard the good ketch sailed was putting them further and further out of the dangerous lee corner of Tremadoc Bay. That at least was astern. "When we saw that headland sudden like," said Taffy, "I couldn't be sure whether it was Trencillon or the bluff at the western end of the mouth of hell. This is no place to take chances. Many a ship's done that. They've thought they'd seen Ceylon and run in for the roads, only to get in the breakers. Too late then, so I shouted to you to bring her up, and to keep to windward. Now I'm not sure how far it is to the island, but we'll see." "I hope we'll see," said Yank, "and you'd better hope so too, and there isn't a deal of daylight left now." He peered anxiously to windward. Taffy'd said that it was safe to approach Bardsey Island close to, for the water was deep that side, and there weren't many rocks, but it was nerve-wracking to be standing yet once more towards a dangerous place, with another so close, and so threatening, right under their lee. "Only let's get through this place, Bardsey Sound," Yank hoped, and then, well, at any rate, the ship would have a bit of sea room. Next stop Ireland, or perhaps this place, Nevin. Meanwhile the ketch boiled along in a flurry of spray and spume and foam, and again the thick seas clouded over her. Once, for a few moments, she was in a boiling of the waters, almost as bad as the breakers on the causeway, and the sea leapt and fumed all round her, as if it had quite gone mad, and was no longer capable even of running true. At the same time it was making an awful sound, crying and sighing. It was an eerie experience, and frightening. "The devil's tail," shouted Taffy. "We're doing all right." "All right, you call it. You can have your devil's tail, but I know where we are now. There's only one place like that nearabouts here. It's foul ground, spoiling the water. Foul's the name for it. Well, now we're making a good course for Bardsey Sound. That's something." Yank agreed wholeheartedly with that last remark, and looked round anxiously to see what next the furious waters of Cardigan Bay might throw in the ship's path. Why, the whole place ought not to be called a bay at all. It was nothing but a torment of the waters, a series of holes in the frightful water into which good ships could fall. He thought he understood now why the ancient navigators often drew fierce dragons on their charts, waiting with their mouths open to bite down big ships. It looked as if they could literally happen right there in Cardigan Bay. Maybe the artist had been Portmadoc men, who habitually had to contend with this kind of thing. "Wind's gone fluky now," said Tiny, who was standing close by Yank. "I expect we must be getting in the lee of Bardsey Island. Sea's gone down a bit too, or it would if the foul bottom and the racing tide would let it." "Aye, it's gone down. It won't be so bad there," Taffy chimed in. "You fellows are getting the wrong idea entirely of this lovely cruising round." "Cruising round, my blooming eye!" shouted Chum Jones derisively. "Who wants to cruise around a place called Hell's Mouth, with the devil's tail to ride him?" "Ah, but it's lovely in the summer. Hundreds of yachts come cruising here, I'll have you know." "Not with me in any of 'em," shouted Chum Jones. "Not blooming well me either," said Brum, with a grim look on his face. "When's the blooming summer, may I ask?" chimed in young Don Wiggins, his teeth chattering with the cold. The lad was wet right through and had not been able to eat anything. "Some years we have good summers," said Taffy proudly. "What, some years did you say?" said Yank, horrified. "Do you mean you can go for years without a real summer here at all?" "Ah, there's always many days, that's champion fine," Taffy defended his native climate, "but some years is better than others. Now look at our Icelander there, he thinks this is good weather. The trouble with you fellows is you've been spoiled. Now there's a chap that knows what bad weather really is." Taffy looked at Hans with admiration. The Iceland lad grinned. "Coffee?" he asked hopefully. "Coffee, yes," they all shouted. "You make it?" "Oh, oh," said Hans, and dived for the companion as the ship made a wild swipe at the sea and scooped her jib-boom into green water. The loom of the high land on their starboard beam by this time was clearly to be seen, and now the ship was racing by a pinnacle of rock, with the tide fairly boiling past it. The water was rushing at the weather side of the rock, as if it was quite insane with anger that the rock should be there at all, and was ferociously determined to smash it down. Poor whales, with all this stormy water forever roaring at her. Yank watched the onrush of the sea. He shivered for the moment. It would be an awful sea to be spilled into. Men who fished round here must be sailors indeed, like those old Portmadoc boys and the men of all that wild peninsula. No wonder they were seamen, and thank heavens the tide was with the warspite now. The old ketch must be making better than 14 knots over the ground, for the tide was racing 5. "Like a racehorse, Yank, isn't she?" said Tiny. "It's good to be here, I mean. I don't know where we are going or where we'll fetch up, but I wouldn't be anywhere else, not for anything. You know, Tiny, that's just the way I feel. Funny, isn't it? With the rain streaming down my neck, and the ship trying to turn somersaults, and the sea racing up astern, trying to swamp us there and smash us down. Yet I wouldn't be anywhere else, not for anything. Nor me either. I ought to be at classes aboard the Conway now, if it wasn't for this course. Good old course. I wouldn't mind now being in Oxford, said young Don Wiggins. I don't see this is so wonderful. Give me my feet on dry land. They're going to stay there. Once I get 'em that way again. Ah, you haven't got the right spirit, said Tiny. You'd be better with a feed inside you. If I could only keep it down. You'll get used to this, Don. Danged if I wants to stay that long. They all grinned at this. Meanwhile the ship must have been racing through the Sound, with Bardsey Island all unseen to windward. Visibility was perhaps quarter of a mile, and they were very close to the coast of Wales. Now they raced from rock to rock, with the breaking water on the cliff bases seemingly only a few yards away. It's all steep too, safe enough. Keep her as she goes, Yank, said Taffy. I see the wind outside isn't so bad, either, if we can judge by the sea. They could see the open waters of the Irish Sea now, leaping beyond the Sound. The chart was open on the seat inside the deck-house, where it could be consulted quickly. Taffy knew the coast without a chart. Bryce y Poil, he shouted, suddenly pointing to a grim high bluff towering in the murk almost above them. It's the end of the Sound. You can keep close to yon and let her fall off as soon as she's by, and run for Nevin. The big ketch came storming by the cliff at what looked like 20 knots, and was probably all of 15, for she was feeling the gale again beyond the brief shelter of Bardsey. She put her shoulder down and tore along in a welter of foam, and as she rounded the point and fell off before the wind to race towards Nevin, she strained and leapt as if she might almost take off and become a jet-propelled airplane at any moment. She was carrying too much sail. Yank knew that, but the anchorage at Porth Dinalan was still 15 miles away, and he knew they must make it before dark. Taffy said the ship could keep close inshore, picking up the high land from time to time. Most dangers, he said, were very close to the beach. He knew them all. I'm looking forward to a good meal when that anchor's down, he said. She'll lie there, snug's a bug in a rug, you see. It was difficult for the boys to believe that any ship could lie snug anywhere along that grim and mountainous coast. Very dubious about it, Yank closely examined the chart for the 20th time. Quite close in by the beach at Port Dinalan. It was true there might be a good anchorage for very small vessels, but the ketch drew over 11 feet of water, and she could not get into the best places. Besides, the bay looked horribly open to him. It was all right while the wind was south of west, but if the wind worked round to anything north of west, as inevitably it must, then they would have to get out, and get out fast, for they would be on a terrible lee shore. At a few minutes before 6, he slipped below to have a look again at Mr. Hughes, who seemed to be sleeping heavily, and to hear the BBC's weather forecast. Before the weather forecast, there are gale warnings to shipping in the Irish Sea and a dozen other places. The forecast began as soon as he turned the radio on. It went on to speak of a fresh westerly gale in the Irish Sea and Lundy, which would be severe at times, but would veer slowly to the northwest. Veer slowly to the northwest, then Porth would be impossible. Yank went up on deck and called a council of war. This place, Porth What's-its-name, won't do, he said. The wind's going around to northwest soon. Who says that, Yank? Asked Taffy. The BBC. Ah, the blessed BBC. They're always slandering our weather. Not without cause, said Tiny. Doesn't the wind always finish up in that quarter, though, Taffy? Aye, often it does, but it takes time to veer around. Maybe we could get the night in. Maybe won't do, Yank shook his head. There's a good lifeboat at Port Denelin, said Taffy. Lifeboat? We won't be needing that, thank you. Yank was vehement. But Tiny was about making for these straits between this island here. I see Anglesey's the name, and the mainland. Your Conway's there, isn't she? Is it any use for shelter? The Conway's far up Menai Straits, said Tiny. I've never been down at this Caernarvon Bay end, but I know there's a very bad bar across there. I should think it would be hopeless in this sort of weather. It would be night, too. You remember, by the time we get there. It's quite hopeless to get in there without a pilot, and he'd not come out in this gale, said Taffy. He couldn't. No, don't go there, Yank. We'd get jammed on the lee shore again up there. What a place. You'd think it was designed just to harass ships. Well, what do you suggest? How about further north now? There's this place around the corner, Holyhead. I've heard of that. It's a shelter port, isn't it? With long breakwaters. Aye, it's a fine place. We could make for there, but there are bad rocks round Holly Island. Maybe it's the best we can do, Taffy agreed gloomily, loth to give up the idea of going to his beloved Nevin. Do you agree, Tiny? Shall we try for Holyhead? Yes, Yank, it's a good place. We'd certainly be all right if we once got in there. Iceland, you have a look at the chart. We're figuring on making for this place here, this Holyhead, around the corner there by the North Stack. What do you think of it? Yank and all the lads had learned to respect the Icelanders' sea sense that long wild day, but it seemed that the idea of getting shelter hadn't occurred to the flaxen-haired lad. He had thought they were merely having a good sail. He looked from Yank to Tiny and from Titch Edwards to Chum Jones, who were also in the council. Holyhead, he asked dubiously. Yes, that place there, Yank pointed with a big wet finger. What for? Shelter. Get the anchor down. Fix up the mate. Get a doctor. Oh, fix the mate. Okay, let's go. So it was decided. Holyhead it was. Yank went out on deck and brought the ship to the wind again, to lie the new course. for the Nevin Peninsula, over towards the western end of Holly Island. With luck she might make it by midnight, and at any rate, now she had sea room, he was not going to sail into any more diabolical bays.